I don't know. I remember a couple of years ago, maybe it's by virtue of my age or whatever, but just I remember a lot of people struggling with that concept and or struggling with just, branding and, gosh, there was some old op-ed writer for some newspaper. I can send it to you, but, sort of the way that a lot of the rise of the branding stuff was met, this writer sums up very well because he said something like, branding is for cattle, and the whole fixation on branding and sort of that becoming the business model. That what that writer felt was being surrendered is like publications used to give readers what they felt they needed, and now with branding, they're giving readers what they hope they want. Mm-hmm. And again, that can sound snobby, but I think it's only bad if we also lose that giving people what we think they need. And
in the long run, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that just sort of like a lot of websites sort of homogenizing to a point of everyone covers the same stuff. Mm-hmm. It's just not interesting. And I remember that being another thing, too, that really attracted me to writing about games.
We were definitely talking about that before.
Yeah, I mean, I just felt that, like, well, world doesn't need another person writing about Call of Duty. I'm gonna, I even use just that limited capacity of a 400-word review to. I'm gonna review the Murder, She Wrote hidden object game. That's still a thing that in games where it seems like weird if you're like not writing about a thing that everyone else is writing about.
Biggest thing, you got to chase the algorithm. Yeah,
I don't know why that is. I mean, I was just emailing with a colleague.
I do think some of it is like unfortunately tied to just the state that media writing is in, where it's just like when you gotta get the ad revenue up. Like it is kind of like.
But why does that trickle down to like readers who have no real stake other than like? Is it a identity thing? Is it a popularity thing? Like, why do they need to comment at all if they're not? I don't know. There's no answer to that, but this is another thing I've been wondering.
I think it's kind of a variable thing. Like, for some people, it's just going to be because they enjoy engaging in that, and then for other people, it's going to be because, or maybe for other people, maybe they don't. Like, Game of Thrones happened, but Game of Thrones is done, and there were so many articles on websites that are a bit more geared for games, and because Game of Thrones was a relevant topic, at least you could guarantee everyone was talking about it. And there were some media people who were just like, oh, thank goodness, no more Game of Thrones articles on game publications. And I think like some people want it, some people don't. I think it's a little bit variable, but it is kind of I think it is a thing that writing shows, that like we are all at least aware of it, right? Like we're all aware and maybe a little bit tired of how much it's got to be the popular, trendy, branded thing.
I don't know if we're all tired of it. It's still happening.
I do think some are getting tired of it.
I think some are, yeah.
Some are, which is, I think, a good sign, at least, or it's a sign of something, right?
No, it's just progress isn't always
cyclical.
It's never fast enough for people who see the need for it. That's all, and it's never linear, and it's always, if it is cyclical, it's like one foot is going in a circle and the other is going like 2 steps back. So. Mm-hmm. Hopefully we keep going forward and don't fall over from getting dizzy.
Yeah. I'm actually going to switch these into a different direction here.
Sure.
I think this is some more newer stuff to talk about. The first one, I'm actually switching the order here, but the first one I want to talk about is, because we're really talking about like brand and media and stuff. Something came up. I don't remember what made me think about this, but this is like a fill in the blank question that I will extrapolate on for you. But I realized that my generation cannot escape media, but I don't have the second half blank. It's the way the previous generation couldn't escape blank. And what I'm saying there is essentially that, like, for me as somebody who was born in the 90s, and I've got a sibling who was born in the late 80s, the people of this generation, we experienced a time where things were only what we could get our hands on, and whatever would be broadcasted for that time. And reruns did exist, but it's not like we necessarily had access to all of it. And then once we started getting money, once we started becoming financially independent a little bit, suddenly everything for all mediums became way, way more accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Suddenly, for a subscription service, we could stream the entire series of MASH. We could find an entire music collection. I could listen to every Genesis album, right? And so for our generation, we never had a chance to let those things that we were enjoying in our childhood kind of die for a bit. We didn't get a chance to really distance ourselves from it too long to really consider its qualities a bit more deeply. And I can tell that like there's certain baby boomer generations like my dad where for them technology enabled communication for that, right? So Facebook and cell phones radically changed that. That's why it was such a big deal for them to suddenly be able to talk to their high school friend that they moved away from and never saw again for 30 years. It's a huge deal.
Yeah.
I can understand where that came from. But there's a generation between the two that I don't really know what like your generation couldn't escape from once technology enabled it.
I don't know why, but my go-to is loneliness. Like,
ooh, okay.
I
like that.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that's even necessarily like what my actual answer is, but that is true. I mean, that is such a thing that has kind of disappeared, even if you try to mitigate or balance your relationship with technology and screens. Is even if you take a breather from it, it never really disappears. And especially now with like push notifications. I mean, I have a very weird relationship with technology. My phone is always on do not disturb.
Yeah.
I don't like notifications popping up. I don't want my phone ringing to interrupt me. I like to be, this sounds again snobby, I like to be present for the things that I'm doing. I like to try to be paying full attention. Well, it's just, it's
be here, not there.
Yeah. And so I don't know if that's like me trying to preserve the way things used to be, because time is linear, and so I was never an adult when I was a child, you know. But it is true, and I don't think I say it with nostalgia. And nostalgia, by the way, is from the Latin or whatever, means like pain from an old wound. I don't. A lot of people tell me this, so I guess it's true. Like, I don't think I'm a particularly sentimental person. I'm not fixated on the past, but the past is valuable because it tells you what has changed and where things have drifted. It is true. Like, I don't know if you saw Chris Rock's most recent stand-up special, but he has
I just watched it the other night.
Oh, okay. So you'll remember better.
Tambourine, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
You'll remember better than I, but he said something about how like you don't hear that sentence anymore. I missed you, because we're always just in each other's screens and each other's pockets all the time. We're with each other all the time.
It's my dad. He illustrated it how he said like my dad would leave at 6 a.m. He wouldn't come home till 10 at night and he wouldn't call or talk to his wife the whole time. Right. If one of us kids died, he'd get home at 10 p.m. and he'd find out then.
Yeah, I mean,
but yeah, it's true.
There's less dramatic ways to think about it. It would just be, I can remember a couple of years ago there being a rise of a certain amount of pieces of like, oh, does texting make it too easy to bail on other people? This is before I think we had the word ghosting. To cancel plans or to flake out or not show up. I mean, it used to be you'd call, and if you couldn't get a hold of that person, if they had an answering machine, there was still technology in our lives. I think it's very tempting and very sexy to say like, oh, we've never been more fragmented than we are now. We've never been more isolated. We've never been more depersonalized. I think when people make those statements, and I hear a fair amount of them just with the beacons I've put down and the work I've been doing the last few years, I think when people say those kinds of things, they're actually telling you more about their personal relationship with the internet, their personal relationship with their phone, their personal relationship with technology. I mean, it is true we don't have that anymore, where you would call someone and you didn't even know. I mean, I think that still happens today. It's not that different. Like, you would call someone, maybe they never checked their voicemails. It's the same as maybe they never checked their answering machine. What there was more of was just that sort of logistical, how are we even going to find each other at this thing?
Yeah,
because
I'll be there underneath the Ferris wheel.
Right. But there could be a different Ferris wheel, and you were guys both, you each thought the other stood you up.
I heard something similar about, like, was it? This was a real story I heard from. It was a friend of mine whose dad had passed away some years ago, and he got a call from his brother, and his brother was at the cemetery trying to find their dad, and like 20 minutes of conversation trying to direct his brother to the right spot, and then he realized his brother's in the wrong cemetery, like,
yeah,
completely wrong spot. And
so I wonder, I don't know if there's like a specific thing you wanted to tie this back to. I mean, I'm trying to think of like the whole, like, do consumers really have a choice? Like I think it's very tempting to paint all, marching forward as inherently bad. I think it's a mix of good and bad. I think it's like, I was talking with a friend last night, and he was talking about, I think he's a little more harsh about the internet than I am, but he works in a completely different field than I do, and he's married. Just our lives are different in some very pivotal ways. And he was just saying that, like, it's easy to get knowledge on the internet, but it's very difficult to get wisdom. And I think he meant that in a more dismissive way of, like, oh, no one has anything smart to say on the internet. And I sort of countered with, like, well, wisdom is always earned. I mean, it's not like a thing. You can't Google some wisdom.
It takes experience.
Yeah.
Right?
And
like,
so
it takes time and experience.
I guess, like, if it's to tie it back, it's to tie it back to loneliness. I do think that, like, in line with, like, what Chris Rock was saying, it's like, maybe what we're sort of losing, and I think video games are a part of this, and I think that at times they are sort of unfairly singled out for this, is just our ability to distract ourselves and not really just be who we are without needing to consume stuff. Like, yeah. And there are other, I think that's just sort of why there's a lot of friction on the internet. Like, obviously there's a lot of other things happening in our culture right now, but it's like you don't need to have an opinion about everything all the time, and you don't need to disagree with everything all the time. I mean, that's sort of like what this, that's for me, that's what Don't Die is a big thing, a big journey of for me, is just trying to figure out, well, what do I even think? Yeah. And so, right. And I am interested, it's like, I couldn't Google the wisdom of, what do all these people all over the world think? So the Googling, quote unquote, comes in having hopefully considered conversations and listening, and I think that really speaks to both the good and the bad of the internet, of posting just conversations of two people talking. It seems so foreign, it seems so alien on the internet, because at least that was more true then. I guess it is true now, but I think that, like, I think it's difficult for people to feel like they can reclaim themselves through technology, and maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe it's because you can't do that through technology because it's not a person. Yeah. And it's not you,
Sure.
I don't even know.
I like that answer, though. I like
thank you.
The loneliness angle. Like, were you a part of, was it the latchkey generation?
Oh, you mean like
the generation of kids where the parents didn't pay attention to what their kids were doing all the time, or no?
Yes and no. I mean, I had like a key, and I would let myself in after school and eat my probably super unhealthy microwave hamburgers and French fries, the Micro Magic the red boxes, which I doubt you even remember because I think they were probably taken off the market back then.
Most kids were allowed to just go out and do whatever.
Well, it was different, and it's different from my parents' generation, which was like
Sure.
they didn't even care. That was more of a don't be home. We don't care what we're doing. What you're doing. Dinner is at 7. That was more of my dad's experience. Whereas for us, it was like, here's a key. You can stay home. Don't have friends over. And I think obviously like that's where a lot of like playing video games happened. That's where a lot of that sort of history started.
Sure.
But
I'm tying that back to like where where suddenly you can't escape from that loneliness comes from, where it's just like, because I bet it's an appreciation for it to some extent because you had it at a time.
I don't know. I'm not even saying that like I was a particularly lonely kid or I'm a particularly lonely adult. I think lonely may not have been the best.
Maybe just having
alone,
time for yourself, being alone.
Being alone. Like, but growing up in the house I grew up in, it's like they weren't particularly scrutinous, if that's the word. They didn't really scrutinize like what media we were consuming. They didn't really say like you can't play. Like if it had come out, I'm sure I probably could have gotten Grand Theft Auto. When I was 13 or 12 or something.
Got it.
And I don't know if that's more of a just general respect and trust, or I think just growing up, just like our house was the house where like my friends who couldn't watch The Simpsons, they would come over.
To your house.
They would come over to our house and watch The Simpsons.
Got it. Okay.
I can remember being 2 or 3, so I'm told, and like my family was watching Alien.
Yeah.
And them not ushering me out of the room. But I think that that's a true thing with child raising too, which is like if you don't sort of, for lack of a better way or a more elegant way of phrasing it, like if you don't freak out about certain things, like, and you don't put real intense restrictions on them, like, the child will grow up like not having a really strained or fraught relationship with certain things. Although I still have never seen Alien. So it's possible it scarred me for life then. Although I have no memory of that happening. And that is the kind of story where it's like, I bet somebody was exaggerating. I would have to look up if that was even possible if I was 2 when, and the movie was out on VHS. But, like I can remember like at a Thanksgiving, growing up, and maybe I was 13, of like having Mortal Kombat on Super Nintendo.
Yeah,
and like, and my aunt and uncle referred up to Mortal Kombat only as quote unquote that scary game, and they wanted my assurance that my cousin would not see or play Mortal Kombat during Thanksgiving. Yeah. So I don't know. That's like a weird latchkey thing, but like,
sure.
I don't think it's born of like indifference. It's more of like a do what you want.
On my own little like portion of this, like I recently went through this thing where I was only in college, not working. I had this grand opportunity to just pay my way through college and be able to just focus on that, and that still meant I still had quite a bit of time on my hands and increasing levels as I got closer and closer to graduation.
Yeah.
And so I decided what to do with my time was to I went through my video game library and said, all right, what's titles I haven't played in so long? Because regardless of the fact that like my generation is one that doesn't get the opportunity to let things die for a bit, there's so much media, you will not be looking at something for a long time.
Yeah.
So I looked at games that I hadn't played in like 10 or more years, right? And went through those, as many of those as I could again. I played through the missed games for the first time in a long time. And it was this really fulfilling thing to go through various different pieces of entertainment that I have experienced before, but when I was younger, it really allowed something good for me to go back and actually go to something that I was able to escape for some time. I watched I just finished watching House, even though I watched a lot of it when I was younger. I watched it every week with my dad for a while, and then we stopped like halfway through the show. So now like going back and watching the show as a much older adult and being able to consider the themes and the characters and the writing, like I felt like that was a healthy relationship with the things that we consume and deal with in a way that's way better than just always experiencing the new one and always having to be up to date with it. I said, you know what, how about I just forget about those for a bit and just kind of do whatever, I feel like in terms of that aspect. And I feel like the same thing could probably be said about like when it comes to the always on connection, when it comes to giving yourself time to be alone.
Yeah.
I think like there's nothing wrong with, and maybe even encourageable to have a little bit of all of it. Because like, what's the old phrase saying? Too much of anything's bad for you. It's just like
moderation.
A moderation, right? A moderation of all the things. It's so important. Like the only way we're gonna get that wisdom is through experience and through being able to know more about things. And I think the same thing comes with like media and with the way people consume it. It's like best way to like know about it is to go through a couple times and then let it sit on the shelf for a while and then come back to it later and think about what its relevances were. Like we can now say why the Lord of the Rings was such a big deal, the films, but we know that now after 20 years and what it means and how it changed things in the film industry.
I only just saw those I think a year and a half ago.
The first time, really?
Yeah, so that's something to know about me. So I have a different relationship with consuming media, and that's probably by virtue of my career.
Sure.
And my relationship with entertainment stuff and other people's opinions about it. I tend to not want to revisit stuff.
Okay.
Just because there's so much.
There's more.
There's just so much. Much, and I tend to. I think it's very rare, and it's not. This is not a snob thing. This is just a time management thing. I very rarely am like experiencing the thing that's of vogue in that moment. Like I think the end of Breaking Bad was a time when I was watching it when it was happening. There was the first season of True Detective I watched when it was happening. At that time, with my access to HBO, I think I caught half of an episode of Game of Thrones. That's the most that I had ever seen. It was like the middle half of a random episode that my roommates were watching. I don't think I've ever felt that way with video games, but my video game relationship is an outlier anyway because I am lucky to get stuff early before other people get it, and so then I get weird feelings of guilt wrapped up in it, where even if it's understood that I can't promise I'm going to write anything about it, I still feel like, well, I have it early, so I should play it and be aware of
something with it, right?
But I'm like 20% of the way through like 80% of the games that are out there, and my Steam library is insane, and
that's part of why I did what I did.
There's so much stuff, but I don't feel... So
many people want you to be caught up, or there's this feeling of that.
But I don't have pressure from that. I just... Okay. It's like it'll be there someday. And especially like as I sort of have ebbed on, publishing criticism, it's relevant to me in a different way. Like it's good to be conversant on what's out there, but like... I don't know. Like I have a lot of thoughts on criticism and critics and stuff. Like, it's good to be able to. I don't know, because there's a lot of different schools, and I'm not an expert. But there are those who feel like the game is a conversation in and of itself, and it's not relevant to bring up other games. And then there's an even stricter, or a slightly, or maybe adjacently strict school, which is like, well, when you're criticizing a game, it's not even relevant to bring up other creative works, period. And I just sort of react strongly against both of those, because there tends to historically there's been so much myopia around games, where it's like any opportunity that's missed to help connect it to a broader horizon is a bad move. That's an inelegant way of putting it. But especially for like what I do, it's impossible to play everything and to be aware of like all the topics that are raised in all the big budget games and all of the under the radar games and all of the ones in between. I mean, games criticism in particular is really difficult because, and I don't think there's any sort of conspiracy involved with this. Just like as video games, there's a lot of video games become 40, 60, 80 hour outings. It's nearly impossible to write a considered review. It used to be with music and stuff. Like I can remember, I think in the 60s and 70s, sometimes it would be like critics would sit with a record for like a month and a half before they would write something. And so just sort of the way it's in lockstep with, here's, the marketing stuff again, the expectation that you're going to have an insightful, considered, well thought out review for a game. Because like when I was at The Onion, it would be like they'd give you the game on a Friday and your deadline would be Monday.
Yep.
And who does their best work rushed over a weekend? But a lot of games critics, have learned to rise to that. And I've seen other things too, like living reviews or et cetera, et cetera. I mean, now it's at the point where like I'm not really interested in reviews. I'm not really interested in like other people's pre-chewed opinions and sort of. There's this like whole aspect to game culture online, and I think it's a subset of all internet culture of like we need to have a consensus on everything, and if you don't agree, then you're a bad person.
Yep.
And so that maybe that's a snob thing too, but like it's created in me a real lack of interest of like reading reviews, and it's created more of an interest of I want to just experience these things for myself, and I'll form my own opinion, and maybe I'll share it with friends, but I probably am not going to broadcast it on the internet. And so I don't know, like maybe like my resistance to, I don't even think I'll like go back and replay games I've played before. I don't know. I think it's just like I think it's sort of connected to this instinct I had for a long time of like, I said that I only really read books, and like I'm really only interested in nonfiction. And I've heard Conan O'Brien talk about this thing too. Where he does that too, because he says, he wants to know what happened.
What happened? Yeah. He's got to know, right?
And I was like, I'm just going to say that now about myself, because it's the same thing. And of course, obviously, there's very few differences between me and Conan, but I'm a little bit more interested in video games than he is. I don't know. And so I think that's what that's more tied to is like, I really want to know what happened, and it's not even like seeking out the new. Like I've been playing a lot of PlayStation 3 games lately, which makes zero sense because I would think after 10 months being tied up writing a book, I would finally make a beeline to playing Red Dead Redemption 2, but I just find it difficult to, gaming for me has become like a chapter of a book before bed, and it's like it's so up in the air, like whether I'll even have energy to play something when it gets to be that time of day. So I don't know. I don't really think I drifted away from your question.
No,
I told you more than you wanted to know.
Like you said earlier, like the answers are sometimes way more interesting than the question.
Yeah.
Which I think that's just an interesting perspective, because I found in doing what I did was like one of the takeaways was just like for me going back through old stuff for the first time in a long while, if I gave it space, it was a good thing. I got to experience it differently and perceive things differently. And then the other perspective was just like I really did come to the conclusion that just like this whole like you gotta be up to date thing, like I enjoy it sometimes. There's things,
I can't do it, man. I can't do it.
It's enjoyable sometimes, but I also know that in this era, in this time, there's too much. So who cares?
Sometimes
do what feels, go with what
you're
feels
good.
In.
Do it. For me, it's like sometimes I don't know. I don't think I ever really judged it. I just know what is healthy for me is to not be doing all the things all the time, and I trust that even though like my preferences have gone I'm surprised because I used to be very much like, oh, I want to have physical copies of everything I own. But the older I get, the less crap I want to have around me.
Easier to move.
Yeah. So I've gone all digital, like my Nintendo Switch. I think I only have physical copies of games that were sent to me, including Farming Simulator 2018. So that stuff will be there, especially the physical stuff will be there for me when I'm ready. But I know just sometimes like I'll reach a point where it's almost like, I don't know, I feel like soul sick, or I get some sort of like radiation feeling from pop culture where it's like I remember feeling this way years and years ago. I'm like, oh, there has to be more to life than just consuming media. Because to me, and that's not just any one. It's just like I think this is years before I sort of have reached a point where I try to spend a period of time every day outside, and I think this is before I started like regularly being sort of tanned or at times sunburned. And I don't mean to imply like I'm some sort of shut-in or hermit. I think I probably still am. It's just sort of like, I don't know, like, yeah, it's by virtue of a career I've been lucky to have where I've had a lot of, close contact with people who create entertainment. Like I get to talk to them and I get to see behind the curtain a little bit. And I get to experience a lot of stuff. And, it's sort of it excreted that gland of enjoyment. Sounds so gross. Just it accelerated that gland excretion, if you will, and it really just fostered like, finding other interests and doing other things. And so going back and I don't know. I mean, it's a lifelong journey, your relationship with these things. So there may be a point where I'm like, that's time to, I'll be like, oh, I remember kind of watching Saved by the Bell when I was a kid, but maybe now that I'm 45, I should rewatch it. And as I say that, that's a thing that I probably will be doing. So check back with me in 9 more years.
I'll make sure to include it on the question.
Yes, please do. All I really remember is Zach and Slater and Screech.
Do you think video games have influenced bad behavior in any way?
Well,
like gamified, rewarded bad behaviors?
Gosh, I mean, it's hard without getting more granular on all aspects of those questions to know what we're talking about, because I know that's the perception, right? The video games are to blame for a lot of bad behavior, and I also know, I mean, that the whole gamifying thing, which I know was sneered at earlier this decade. I know, well, I mean, that's talked about in that book that I mentioned too. I'm sorry that I'm going to be.
Oh, it is? Okay, cool.
I'm just sort of like reopening my eyes to everything else that's going on in the world after being so focused on writing my own book. So just a lot of my view on stuff right now is like, well, I'm reading this book, and they do talk a fair amount about how insidious gamifying is. And this is not an anti-video game book. I mean, they talk about Facebook, and they talk about like the way that Roombas are, if you give them, if you give them the functionality that they actually require to function, they do things like broadcast your floor plan of your house, and they're selling that data. They're and I don't know. There's all these things that it's such a mess, and it's like the author does write about like gamifying as a way of framing like you voluntarily offering your data and trying to make it seem fun. And I can remember like in those early game developer conferences I mentioned that I got to go to with The Onion, I can remember people talking about gamification and how they always were trying to clarify it's not gamification, it's pointsification, because these are not proper games. And I think that's a very common video game way of looking at the other side sees what they're doing, which is kind of missing the point a little. It's like this is not a reflection of any particular thing about video games, it's a reflection of the human common denominator of how easily manipulated we are or can be
into certain behaviors.
Yeah, which I think certain behaviors which actually are like selling ourselves out, you know.
Yep.
I don't see, the thing is, like, I don't feel like I know enough about gamification or pointsification to really speak to it other than things I've heard or read.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I'm not really on social media.
Sure.
I I have like no apps on my phone.
Right.
I'm in the process of like probably shifting away from Gmail. Like, I don't know. I'm just starting to do a bigger purge to see like how much more.
I can't wait to start a chain written mail system with you instead of Gmail.
No, I'll still be accessible. It's just
I get where you're going.
But I feel like I can't even really give a good answer to it unless there's some sort of nasty thing that you've seen that maybe, I mean, I can maybe react to that, just sort of going in cold. I'm like, gee, I don't know. Makes me think of like reading contests that they had in like 5th grade, where they, you know, would try to motivate you to read by giving you points.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Oh, I never thought about that.
I mean, our whole education system is gamified, you know?
It is, yeah. It's true. I think
about that.
There wasn't.
We're blowing it open.
I think there wasn't like any particular thing about it so much as just a lot of the. Maybe I wasn't tying it to video games, or maybe tying it to video games is about as strange as you kind of are saying it sounds in ways. It's.
That's okay. I mean, I just curious. I want to make sure. I want to if there's a question or thing you're wondering about, if I can speak to it, I'd like to. I just don't know. I just don't know everything.
I personally know that you retracted yourself from publics and social media and things like that, and I have no qualms with that at all. I think it's not. I think people need to do what they need to do to be okay. And you told me that the conclusion you reached with that stuff was just like it's just not healthy. And so and even though you think it's not healthy for yourself, and that's a good thing for you to do. And I think about this stuff, and I think about how, I wonder if stuff like that is rewarding bad behaviors in ways, and not suggesting or encouraging good behaviors, and what kind of an impact that has on younger generations. You know,
do you mean like the impulse to opt out is rewarding bad behavior?
No, I'm suggesting that those places reward bad behavior or suggest they don't have ways to discourage bad behavior.
But I think
they only have ways to.
I think opting out does reward bad behavior. I mean, I do lurk on Twitter from time to time because it's just. And obviously, hopefully, my continuing with this and the sort of work I do does demonstrate I am sincerely curious with other people's perspectives and what they're struggling to make sense of, and just the ongoing journey of us trying to learn from each other. It's just that I have created, I'm fortunate enough to have created a platform that seems to have decent legs where, people can just talk to each other, and that sort of is a more traditional method of us learning from each other. I know that could also be a generational thing where, people around your age or younger that I've interacted with, it seems like that is a very snobby thing of you mean I have to
talk?
I have to actually talk and put my, it's it's seen as lesser because it's not a white hot reaction off the top of your head to a thing, which is a different way of interacting. Which is a different way of interacting with other people, and so I think it's I think the impulse that a lot of people have to opt out, it rewards bad behavior, and that it upsets the power dynamic, and it rewards, or it rather than reward, it creates real estate where that type of stuff can be heard more loudly than other frequencies or other perspectives. I would just posit that as a user, it's not my job to.
Oh no, not at all. Yeah, I really wasn't trying to shift this on you.
No. It's a thing that I think about a lot, and I think that it's sort of unfairly is like all poo-pooed, but I think it's the same as video games, and I think it's the same as a lot of other forms of technology where it's poo-pooed, but just because it's poo-pooed doesn't minimize its importance or its capacity to connect people who are not like the person criticizing it. Yeah. The communication is not a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. I mean, it's funny, you talk about, or one thinks about, like, gaming toxicity. I keep hinting at this book stuff, even though I don't want to get too much into it. I don't think this is even wound up being in the book, but like one of the interesting things I had learned was just there was a great deal of friction that had occurred in Second Life when they added voice chat, because people who were deaf, if I'm remembering this correctly, felt lesser, because they were now not having the same experiences as everybody else was going to have, that they could now hear each other, and that was the thing that they could not do. I think it's just like, I think it's very easy to be like, Twitter is broken and the internet's terrible. I mean, and they're when they're saying that, they're saying that's their experience with it, and I think that's a very common experience with it. And so when I think about like, I never really made a big noise about walking away from Twitter. I may try to come back later at some point. It's like, because I think it's that very much, like clarifying on that, I guess it's like tied to the impulse of like what attracted me to doing Don't Die in the first place, which was like I was interested in finding people who quit playing video games, because I felt like people who quit playing video games took certain insights with them that were just never going to be heard otherwise. And I think there are a lot of people who have talked about like why they've left Twitter. I think it's like, for me personally, like why that was a healthier thing is, I think this ties back to like right where we were in the beginning. Is like, is that inability to ascertain, like, are people being performative or I don't know. It's just it's such a weird way of communicating, because I think nobody feels listened to on there, and it feeds a lot of approaches and ways of dealing with one another that we would not do in other channels. And by other channels, I mean like IRL. Which I think that sort of, when I was trying to draw that distinction between alone versus loneliness, I think that's what I'm talking about, is the erosion of IRL. Because when I talk to younger people now, like that's not a thing, because the internet is also real life, and it's tough, because I think that is true for a lot of people, but I know that it's also not true for other people. And when you have two things that are simultaneously true that are at odds with each other, which frequently happen, it just causes a lot of friction. I mean, I was always very confused on Twitter, having thousands of followers, but like no one ever really interacted with me. I always felt like I was like a weird texture follow for people. Like people were like generally curious what random, strange / hopefully thoughtful thing.
It's not about the conversation. It's about what are you doing right now. Are you entertaining me?
I'm just sitting here, man. just
talking
to you.
What it is. That's what the Twitter is. Just like, are you entertaining me right now with what you're saying? No. All right. Somebody else is saying something. I'll just pay attention to that.
That's fine. So, but but at the same time, it's like if I hadn't done it, like I probably never would have met you. There's a lot of people I never would have met, and I've made a lot of really good friends with it, and that sort of is like for me the sort of the disappointment of walking away from a thing like that is just missing out on other people, but
connections.
Not even in like in a networking way. It's just that's the thing that I like, is to talk with other people. Maybe people know this about me by now, but people know to reach out to me through my site, and there are other ways. It's just Twitter is a very hyperactive way of doing that. And getting marketed to.
Yeah, all at once.
All at once. Like, my favorite
they're the same thing, right? Like
that's the thing. It's hard to tell which are the sponsored tweets nowadays.
Are you performing to me, or are you just trying to talk to me, right? Like that's what That's what's weird about it.
Yeah.
Unless it's somebody you like actually know. Like I've got friends on there, and when they're saying a thing, we can also just turn it into a conversation. But it's like if you were a professional streamer, I'd always have to think about the fact that it's public, the fact that it's hey, anything he might be saying might be endorsed by in this or that way, instead of let's just talk.
Yeah.
Let's just have a call. Let's just communicate. I think that mostly wraps up the questions I've got here.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. I don't know if I would hope so for me the answers were definitely I enjoyed the answers that they got. I'm hoping this kind of rattled your brain a bit around this stuff. It went slightly different than I was thinking it was going towards.
It always does. It always does.
But I'm totally okay with the journey and the destination it went from the questions asked.
Yeah, I haven't hit stop yet. I mean, I always I don't know, because earlier this year I had a Skype call with a game developer who I had previously interviewed, and being sort of out of circulation for a little while, working on a project like a book, which is just very deeply burrowing into some part of your brain and making sure you're, it's all those things I said before about anticipating intentional misinterpretation, anticipating blind spots, and it's just that to the maximal level. And at a certain point for me, in the path to doing that, and I think this was part of sort of just walking away from Twitter. I sort of felt this need of, okay, I've been spending the last 4 whatever years really zooming in on game culture, game industry, whatever, various fascinations that I have, and it's very cool to see other people's interpretations of what I'm doing and interesting experiences they have that I never would have imagined I would get to hear about, but I absolutely do want to hear about.
Yeah.
And so I think that that is a really good and valuable thing, but it also, the other half of that is the need to communicate it, that I feel, with people who don't run in our circles, the people who have never heard of Jeff Keighley, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess that's the flag we're going to plant.
Because it's not, because you're not just writing it for me or yourself.
Well, yeah, and so I had sort of intentionally started distancing myself in certain ways, and not in I've been hurt and I need to avoid this person. Yeah. It's more of a trying to think about what I've been thinking about. Yeah. Yep. And so I was talking with this game developer, I think in January this year, for a little bit about, just the general temperature of all this stuff that I had wanted to start looking at a couple of years ago. And I think it's really difficult to say what is going on, what is not going on, because it all depends on where you're looking. And I think that there's a tendency to, even when I say game culture, game industry, that's super vague. What is that even referring to? Because now it can get so, it could be that your whole life is just one game series, or your whole life, and by that I mean your whole experience of video games is this will go back to the brand thing. It's whatever your favorite streamer has to say, whatever your favorite publication has to say. Because I think most people don't really, I don't know, I think most people don't, it's that inverted pyramid thing again of a whole telescoping way of, a spectrum of people, a spectrum of ways to think about this stuff. And I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, both immediately in the sentence and also with as I continue on with Don't Die, but that's just the thing, is it always feels for me, every time I feel I have a really good grip on this is what the temperature is all it takes is like one person to tell me that like their experience is something completely different. I was like, oh, well, maybe it's all changed because it's been a while since I've talked to someone who, you know, runs in that certain circle. And so coming back to this stuff after a couple months, I'm kind of stunned at how little seems to have changed, and I'm kind of stunned that I'm stunned, because you would think by now I would know better. I just would have assumed that, like, and I don't know what that is, and I'm not saying you got to ask me anything about it. It's just since this is the dynamic where you're asking me questions, normally by now I would just say, all right, well, thank you for your time, and I'll let you go. And then maybe I'll jot down 2 words on a Post-it note next to me, and then a week later I'll look at it and be like, I don't really know what that means. No, well,
were you like,
yeah.
Were you? So are you saying like you were expecting to like get yourself back into this and see that like one major change had taken place, or is it more just like?
You know, I don't really have specific expectations of things almost ever.
Right,
It's just more like oh, that's kind of surprising.
Okay.
Or you know, but then at the same time, it's always like, well, maybe it's just on this, you know, the most loud channels that it's like this, and maybe it's not like this elsewhere. But I could go on and on and on, but
about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have to, and I will get to with other conversations I have with other people. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just trying at this point now to put a bow on it, but maybe we don't have to put a bow on it, and I can just say thank you.
You can put a bow on it the way you always put a bow on all your other conversations, unless you saved that for the book.
What's that? I just hang up?
No. It's you ask all your interviewers. You ask all your people. What do you think games have accomplished?
Yes. It's interesting because I do that, and it seems like people are always surprised when I ask them that. And I guess you could pose it to me, but as I've started to say that to other people again, you know, what I've observed is most people will laugh. Almost everybody laughs because it's kind of a weird question. Most people will laugh, and either they will say nothing. They'll say, "Oh, they've accomplished nothing," or they will laugh and they'll say, "Oh, they've accomplished everything." and yet I remain confused.
You're just waiting for somebody to be like, a little bit, I guess.
I'm not even looking for a specific answer.
Sure.
And so I guess you know. If I'm not seeking, I don't know. It's fine. I can press stop now. I'll press stop in a second. I was just gonna say, like, I guess, like, you know, that's the thing that if you're not seeking a specific answer, I guess that you will always succeed because you will learn about a lot of things. Yeah. But that sort of is my hope, is that, like, for me and others, is like they will actually learn about things in specific, and it's hopefully nothing that they were ever expecting.
Then I would hope that this gave you your own answers to things that you didn't know. You know, I hope it did what you wanted. You said, like, you wanted to do this to, like, get some screws loose because you were writing for so long. Which I don't, like, you and I talked about, like, how I was interested in writing, and I told you at the time, and that's still pretty true, is that the process of it itself sounds like it requires some sort of insane amount of really high discipline and dedication to really hammer it out and get it done. And that's just getting it done, not even thinking about all the stuff that you were just talking about. And so, like, I really did want to do this. The same thing you were looking to do, which is get your brain a little bit looser, start thinking about the things that we've talked about before, as well as just general stuff, video games, or culture, social aspects to it, anything of that nature I thought would be useful to loosen your brain on these things.